The same playbook that destroyed the greatest empire in human history is playing out right now. Different names, different flags, same pattern. Rome didn't fall in a day. It didn't fall because of one barbarian invasion or one bad emperor. It fell because of a combination so specific, so precise, that when you see it laid out, you won't be able to unsee it in the modern world. Immigration pressure, military overextension, currency debasement, and political division. Sound familiar? It should, because every single one of those forces is active right now, today, in the nations you call home. Same pattern, different empire. Historians will tell you Rome fell in 476 AD. That's the sanitized version. The truth is, Rome was rotting from the inside for over 2 centuries before the final collapse, and nobody in Rome believed it was happening until it was too late. So let's walk through the exact sequence, step by step, and you tell me if this sounds like ancient history or tonight's news. The money trick. Every empire that ever collapsed started with the same move. They debased the currency. Rome's silver denarius was once 95% pure silver. By the time the empire was crumbling, it was less than 5%. The first panacea for a mismanaged nation is inflation of the currency. Emperor after emperor shaved the silver content to pay for wars they couldn't afford and promises they couldn't keep. And here's what's chilling. The Roman citizens didn't notice at first. Prices rose slowly. Merchants adjusted. People blamed each other, blamed immigrants, blamed the weather. Nobody blamed the coin, because the coin still looked the same on the outside. Now think about this. Since 1971, the US dollar has lost over 87% of its purchasing power. The Federal Reserve has printed more dollars in the last 5 years than in the previous 100. Your grandparents bought a house on a single income. You can barely afford rent on 2. The coin looks different today, sure, it's digital now. But the trick is identical. Dilute the value, transfer the wealth upward, and hope nobody connects the dots. But this leads us to something even more dangerous than debased currency. Legions everywhere. At its peak, Rome had legions stationed from Britain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to the Rhine. The empire was stretched so thin that soldiers on the frontier hadn't seen Rome in decades. They weren't fighting for the Republic anymore. They were fighting for whoever paid them. Overextended, underpaid, forgotten. Rome maintained over 30 legions across 3 continents. The cost was astronomical, and every year the frontier grew harder to defend while the treasury grew emptier. Now consider this. The United States currently operates over 750 military bases in at least 80 countries. 750 bases. The annual defense budget exceeds $800 billion. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. American soldiers are stationed in places most Americans can't find on a map. And just like Rome, the cost of maintaining this global presence is hollowing out the homeland. Bridges collapse at home, while bases expand abroad. If you're starting to see the pattern here, hit like and subscribe to keep exposing what they hide, because what comes next connects all the dots. Rome didn't lose its military because the barbarians were stronger. It lost because it couldn't afford to maintain an empire anymore. And speaking of things empires can't afford, borders dissolved. Here's what they won't teach you in school. Rome didn't fall to an invasion. It fell to a migration it couldn't manage. For centuries, Rome absorbed people from conquered lands. Germans, Gauls, Syrians, North Africans. This wasn't a problem when Rome was strong enough to integrate them. They learned Latin. They served in the legions. They became Roman. But when the empire weakened, the equation flipped. Rome was not destroyed by her enemies. Rome destroyed herself from within. Entire tribes crossed the borders not as conquerors, but as refugees fleeing the Huns. Rome couldn't stop them and couldn't integrate them fast enough. These groups maintained their own languages, their own leaders, their own loyalties. No common language, no common loyalty. The parallel today isn't about any specific group of people. It's about systems. When a nation loses the ability to control its borders and the will to integrate newcomers into a shared identity, it doesn't matter how strong the military is. The social fabric tears from within. And once that fabric tears, it doesn't sew itself back together. But immigration was just the symptom. The real disease was something far more corrosive. The divided Senate. The Roman Senate in its final centuries was a circus. not the kind with gladiators. The kind with politicians who would rather see the empire burn than let the other faction win. Gridlock. Senators formed alliances not based on policy, but on personal power. They blocked legislation out of spite. They weaponized the courts against rivals. They used the military as a political tool. In the 50 years before Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Rome experienced multiple civil wars, political assassinations, and constitutional crises. The system wasn't broken by barbarians. It was broken by Romans who put party before country. The enemy was never at the gates. It was always in the chamber. Now look at Washington, or London, or Brussels. Government shutdowns over budget disputes while infrastructure crumbles. Politicians spending more time fundraising than legislating. Media turning every issue into a tribal war. The Romans had a word for this kind of political decay. They called it the crisis of the 3rd century. 200 years of rotating emperors, military coups, and institutional collapse. We just call it Tuesday. And this political paralysis had a direct consequence that nobody wanted to face. Bread and circuses. The Roman poet Juvenal coined one of the most prophetic phrases in human history. Give them bread and circuses, and they will never revolt. By the late empire, roughly 1/3 of Rome's population received free grain from the state. The Colosseum hosted games that lasted weeks. Chariot races drew crowds of 250,000. The government learned something terrifying. You don't need a productive citizenry if you can keep them fed and distracted. Fed, distracted, controlled. Now scroll through your phone for 10 seconds. Social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement. Streaming platforms with infinite content. Fast food on every corner. Government stimulus checks during crises. The modern circus is just a smaller screen. The average American spends over 7 hours a day on screens. 7 hours. That's not leisure. That's sedation. And just like in Rome, the people who provide the bread and circuses aren't doing it out of generosity. They are doing it because a distracted population doesn't ask dangerous questions. An entertained citizen is a compliant citizen. And compliance leads to something even darker. Elite disconnect. In the final centuries of Rome, the gap between the patricians and the plebeians wasn't just wide. It was a canyon. The wealthy elite retreated to massive country estates called latifundia. They hired private armies. They avoided taxes through political connections. They lived in a completely different Rome than the one crumbling around the average citizen. The rich built walls around their gardens, while the walls around the empire fell. Meanwhile, the middle class, the backbone of any functioning society, was being squeezed out of existence. Small farmers couldn't compete with slave labor estates. Artisans couldn't afford rising prices. Veterans returned from decades of service to find their land taken. No middle class, no empire. Today, the top 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. CEOs earn 350 times their average worker. The modern latifundia aren't country estates. They're hedge funds, offshore accounts, and private islands. The Romans had a phrase for this too. The sinews of war are infinite money. When the people who run the system no longer live under the same rules as everyone else, the system has already begun to die. But there's one factor that accelerated Rome's collapse faster than anything else. Outsourced defense. Here's a fact that should disturb you. In the final decades of the Western Roman Empire, the majority of soldiers defending Rome were not Roman. Not Roman. They were Germanic mercenaries. Goths, Vandals, Franks. The empire had become so bloated, so overstretched, and its citizens so unwilling to serve, that Rome literally hired the people it was supposed to be defending against. They paid their enemies to protect them from their enemies. Think about that logic for a moment. The same Visigoths who sacked Rome in 410 AD had previously served as Roman soldiers. They knew every fort, every weakness, every supply line. Hired, trained, betrayed. Now look at the modern world. Private military contractors like Blackwater, now called Academy, have fought in Iraq, Afghanistan, and across Africa. The US spent over $370 billion on private military contractors between 2007 and 2020. That's not defense. That's outsourcing your sovereignty to the highest bidder. Mercenaries and auxiliaries. are useless and dangerous. When a nation stops being willing to defend itself with its own people, it's already lost something that no amount of money can buy back. And this erosion of civic duty points to something deeper. Lost identity. What does it mean to be Roman? In 100 BC, every citizen could answer that question without hesitation. By 400 AD, nobody could agree. The identity that built the empire had dissolved into nothing. Rome's genius was always its ability to create a shared identity. The roads, the laws, the language, the aqueducts. Being Roman meant something. It was a civic religion that transcended ethnicity. You could be Syrian, Gallic, or African and still be fully Roman. But when the institutions weakened, when the currency collapsed, when the military became mercenary, that shared identity fractured into 1,000 local loyalties. No shared story, no shared future. People stopped identifying as Roman and started identifying by tribe, by region, by class. This is the invisible collapse, the one that doesn't make headlines. An empire dies when its people stop believing in what it stands for. Ask yourself, what does it mean to be American today? British? European? Can anyone give you a unified answer? When the shared story dies, the nation follows. It's only a matter of time. And Rome's final lesson is the most terrifying one of all. Nobody believed it. This is the part that should keep you up at night. The Romans didn't know they were falling. Denial. In 400 AD, just 76 years before the official fall, Roman citizens were still going to the baths, still watching chariot races, still arguing about politics in the forum. The economy was struggling, sure. The borders were porous, yes. The currency was worthless, obviously. But fall, the Roman Empire, impossible. Civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. The great historian Edward Gibbon documented how Roman writers in the 5th century were still composing poetry about Rome's eternal glory, while barbarian kings were already dividing up the provinces. They wrote poems about eternity, while the walls burned. This is the most dangerous phase of decline, not the fall itself, but the refusal to see it coming. Normalcy bias is fatal. Every empire believes it's the exception. Every empire believes its technology, its military, its culture makes it immune to the patterns of history. The greatest trick an empire ever pulled was convincing its people it could never fall. But what if recognizing the pattern is the first step to breaking it? Breaking the cycle. So here's the question that matters. If the pattern is this clear, if the parallels are this obvious, can we actually do something about it? History does not repeat, but it rhymes with terrifying precision. Rome's fall wasn't inevitable. There were moments, specific turning points, where different choices could have changed everything. Emperor Diocletian tried reforms. Marcus Aurelius held the line for decades. Individual Romans fought to preserve what was being lost. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. The lesson isn't that collapse is guaranteed. The lesson is that collapse happens when people stop paying attention, when they choose comfort over truth, when they choose entertainment over engagement. Wake up question everything. Currency debasement, military overextension, border erosion, political division, elite detachment, bread and circuses, outsourced defense, lost identity, collective denial. 9 forces, all active, all accelerating. Rome took 2 centuries to fall. In the age of information, things move faster, much faster. The question isn't whether this pattern exists. You've seen the evidence. The question is what you're going to do about it. Rome didn't fall because of one thing. It fell because of everything all at once, compounding over decades until the weight became unbearable. Immigration pressure, military overextension, currency debasement, political division, and a population too distracted to notice until it was too late. Same forces, same denial. The difference between us and the Romans is one thing and one thing only. We have their example to learn from. They were writing the playbook for the first time. We're watching the rerun. So be the citizen who reads between the lines. Be the one who follows the money. Be the one who asks who benefits, who pays, and why they want you looking the other way. If you made it this far, comment pattern recognized to prove you're among the few who actually see what's happening. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Every government lies. The question is, what are they lying about? The truth is out there. You just have to follow the money. Subscribe if you want to keep digging.